The big news last week, the FTC and a bipartisan group including 46 states filed a lawsuit to break up Facebook. And then two groups of states announced two more antitrust actions against Google. So we have the DOJ, the FTC, and angry packs of state attorneys general going gangster on Google and Facebook. These lawsuits are dots forming a line, and that line points to one thing: the beginning of the end of big tech as we know it. It's almost as if they're listening to the dog. That's right, who is in the press release? Highlighted as a scholar, an Attorney General Letitia James press release announcing the action. She got it wrong. The dog's not a scholar. He's a baller. He's a baller. But it's nice to be listened to. No joke. On the way into the studio, my wife yelled at me, you haven't even listened to a word I've said. And I thought, that's a strange way to start a conversation. Anyway, today, a masterclass on antitrust in 3 acts. If you don't know what Masterclass is, here's a refresher. Hi, I'm Anna Wintour. Over the course of the next several weeks, I'll be vomiting platitudes, and while you'll see my lips moving, I won't really be saying anything. Just kidding! It's the dog! Act 1. The Gilded Age. At the turn of the 20th century, men wore top hats and monocles, smoked cigars, and rode bicycles with huge front wheels. That sounds like the worst sex club I've ever been to. True story, I met my wife at a sex club, and what did I say to her? How did I open? Hey, who's watching the kids? That's good. That's good. Anyways, Andrew Carnegie was worth over $300 billion in today's terms, and John D. Rockefeller over $400 billion. How did they get so rich? By dominating the major industries of the era, including steel, railroads, and oil. Rockefeller was the Bezos of the Gilded Age. Just as Bezos saw the promise of the internet age and built Amazon to dominate, Rockefeller saw the strategic value of the oil industry and built Standard Oil to consolidate the sector. Standard Oil didn't just pump the oil, it distributed it through its own pipelines and rail cars. Sound familiar, owning the rails? Refined it into products ranging from lubricants to chewing gum, and created a network to sell it door to door. Standard Oil also made the cans it used to store its oil, and even built the wagons to transport the cans. All this innovation allowed Rockefeller to relentlessly lower prices, increase product quality, and improve customer service. But he was also a bad actor. He leveraged this influence with railroads to block competitors' access to transportation, then offered to buy, at a steep discount of course, the oil of his competition that they couldn't offload. Rockefeller called this cooperation, but his idea of cooperation was sell to Standard Oil or die. By 1904, Standard Oil controlled 91% of oil production and 85% of oil sales in the United States. This was the algorithm for outsized shareholder gains in the Gilded Age. Innovate to gain advantage, then ruthlessly exploit that advantage to squash competition. If that sounds familiar, trust your instincts. Act 2, the Progressive Era. This system of monopoly only worked for the 0.1% who controlled over 20% of the nation's wealth. Shareholders enjoyed returns on the way up, but once a company dominated, it had little incentive to innovate. Consumers had cheaper products, but eventually a dominant supplier will raise prices. Capital concentration made the so-called robber barons incredibly powerful, more powerful than the government that was supposed to regulate them, that was supposed to be a countervailing force, not a co-conspirator. So, in 1911, the federal government broke up Rockefeller Standard Oil into 34 separate firms. Within a year, the value of the companies spun off had doubled, and many of those firms still exist today, including Chevron and ExxonMobil. The breakup benefited consumers, workers, and even Rockefeller himself. For nearly a century, U.S. regulators held the line against monopolies. Mergers that would have created dominant firms were blocked, collusion was prevented, and the competition fueled an economic boom. This model of antitrust enforcement has come to be known as the Brandeisian view. The Brandeisian view argued that excessive bigness among corporations was bad for economic growth and bad for individual freedom, and that it was the government's role to break bigness apart. Fast forward 73 years for another example of how the breakup of monopolies is good for the economy. When AT&T was broken up, the resulting 7 firms were worth more than the standalone company. The job market was also oxygenated. MCI Corporation, a competitor, more than quadrupled their employee headcount in the decade following AT&T's breakup. Innovation also thrived in the 20 years post-breakup, taking us from touch-tone dialing to mobile phones and the consumer internet. Act 3. The Empire Strikes Back. By 1980, we decided that the enforcers of antitrust had beaten up capital for far too long, and that it was time to let labor feel capital's pain as shareholder returns had been anemic. Leading the swing to conservatism was Robert Bork, who argued that antitrust should not care about market structure, political power, or innovation, but should exclusively be concerned with prices as a proxy for consumer harm, or lack thereof. Courts stocked with Reagan and Bush appointees adopted this demented view, and antitrust enforcement went into a long period of hibernation. Since 2000, the Antitrust Division has brought 5 or more non-merger cases only once. In the 1990s, the division brought 5 or more cases for 6 out of the 10 years. What's more alarming? Prior to Google, they'd only pursued 1 monopolization case this century. The result? Markets are now more concentrated and less competitive than at any point since Rockefeller's Gilded Age. Between 1997 and 2012, 2/3 of American industries registered an increase in concentration, meaning the big guys got bigger and the small guys got thrown under a bus. Not a Greyhound, not the dog, but a Google Sprinter van shepherding super interesting young people down Interstate 280. Anyways, a side effect of the era of antitrust is that a number of startups as a percentage of all firms has fallen by roughly 50% since 1978. That's right, despite with the sleeveless dresses and the Trump old men who would like you to spend more time in restaurants and die. They should order the natural selection special. Anyways, twice as many firms were being formed every day during the Carter administration in the late 70s. Why aren't startups thriving? Because the big players won't provide them with any oxygen. Google now controls almost 90% of global search and over 80% in the most developed markets. Facebook can afford to drop $1 billion on an Instagram acquisition to suppress competition, or $19 billion to turn WhatsApp into a data harvesting operation. Simply put, the strong are getting stronger, and as I argue in my recent book, Post-Corona, this is a trend that will only accelerate during the pandemic. As the biggest players further consolidate their gains in lean times, and government is no longer, again, a countervailing force, but a co-conspirator. By the way, that is a key step towards tyranny, said actual scholar Professor Tim Wu. Current antitrust law is like giving your 18-year-old his second-grade Star Wars pajamas and expecting them to fit. The current laws are outdated. We have 19th century institutions and 20th century interpretations trying to govern 21st century problems, and they are failing. Why? Because we need to consider more than just prices. Another problem? We focus on monopolies when we should focus on market power. Monopoly is an abstract whose meaning creates sideshows at hearings. Market power is what moves markets and decides elections. And a company doesn't need to be a monopoly to command that type of market power. In capitalism, capital is power. And power is measured by market capitalization. The ability to acquire competitive threats, absorb losses, or outspend the entire entertainment industry on Transparent and The Morning Show just to sell another iPhone and more toilet paper. That is power. Few VCs will back entrepreneurs stepping on big tech's turf, but big tech still collects a lot of protection money. Roblox, the subject of last week's episode, gangster, still pays a 25% tax to the new government, big tech. 40 cents of every dollar, get that, 40 cents on every dollar raised in venture funding is spent on Google, Facebook, and Amazon. You want the mother of all tax cuts? Break these companies up. In its lawsuit, the government demands that Facebook separate its conjoined triplets and spin WhatsApp and Instagram. This will be great for users, great for democracy, and great for shareholders. Today, the whole of Facebook is worth less than the sum of its parts, as Facebook has squandered, not maximized, the potential of these businesses. The clearest proof? Snapchat. Facebook attempted to buy Snap, for $3 billion in 2013. Today, the company is worth almost $80 billion. That's 26 times Zuckerberg's offer. WhatsApp was started by a guy who was rejected for a job at Facebook and went on to create the world's most popular messaging app, also making it possibly the largest unmonetized technology business in the world. Facebook sent WhatsApp to the glue factory to vomit your data to the highest bidder. If they hadn't done this, WhatsApp might have become WeChat, Zoom, or Slack. Another prediction: Bezos is too smart and too ego-driven to let others decide his fate. So Amazon will prophylactically spin AWS in 2021, which, by the way, by 2025 will be the world's most valuable firm. What's important is that we stop looking at monopoly breakup as a punishment and start viewing it through the lens of the ultimate validation. The only stakeholder antitrust enforcement is bad for: the CEO, who wants to sit on the Iron Throne of all 7 realms versus just being the king of the North. This is the end of big tech and the start of conscious capitalism, a system that sits on a bed of empathy and good government, one that works for everyone and not just the lucky few, not just the robber barons, not just the innovators who we are sick of idolizing. Enough already. We'll see you in 2 weeks.